introducing Armando Iannucci. Good morning, Armando.
Good morning. This is
Sounds as if it was a long night.
This is a sort of punishing thing to do, and
Yes.
they do this every year, don't they? It's like you get this high at the end of the thing, you have to crawl out. I've already been Misha Husseined this morning at 10 to 8 on the Stay programme after Thought for the Day.
Well, it was a terrific barnstorming lecture. You've got that standing ovation. I suppose the one person in the room you had to feel a bit sorry for was John Whittingdale. I did see him outside, actually, and I asked him what he thought of the lecture, and he said he thought it was funny. And that's the thing about creatives, they're just funny.
Good. Right. I didn't realise he was in the audience, otherwise I might have tailored some remarks in his direction.
Well, the other people, I wonder, whether any of those sort of 20 anonymous executives you mentioned, rising without trace, if any of those may have been named.
No, they probably were.
Yeah.
They probably were.
But anyway, what we'll do is have a little bit of discussion about the themes of that speech, and then we're going to take questions. And we have an app, so do submit your questions that way as well. And it seemed to me that the three overriding themes was one, the return to power of the program makers, that you've got to restore that balance. And there was something you said that I saw just made every face sort of lift, tears pouring down cheeks, and that was the HBO boss who said to you, "It's your show, you decide what's best."
Yeah, and that's literally what he said. That isn't, I haven't made that up. That was, I remember having a conversation as we were, after we'd made the pilot, and they said we want to go ahead with the series, and there was just one aspect of it to do with the titles or something like that. And they said, normally HBO do it this way, and I argued for something that was slightly different, and, to show willing, we tried out various ideas, but in the end I came back and said I actually prefer the way, and Mike Lombardo at HBO said, "It's your show." And I just thought that's a tremendous amount of trust to put in someone, and an enormous amount of responsibility that you get as a result of it. So you have to be responsible with what you're making. And also, the scale of a show for HBO is far bigger. I think the cost of one episode of Veep was the equivalent of a whole series of the thick of it. So you suddenly are aware that you are managing. I call myself a small businessman when you're a producer, but actually you're a major businessman when you're doing an HBO show, because you do have an impact. That's what I was saying about, even though it's a creative industry, it is an industry. And, people's jobs are on the line, and money is so crucial. And that is why the governor of Maryland came to visit us, because actually we were filming in Baltimore and we were providing 1,000 jobs to people in Baltimore. And surrounding area. And, the Baltimore Sun would do articles about how crucial this was to bring investment back into the city and so on. I think we do it a little bit with the film industry here. We do the tax breaks for filming, and we try and make it as easy as possible for, Star Wars to be shot here, and Alien, and all the huge shows. Gravity was all shot here. So the big film studios and the film locations, and using London as a base to shoot for foreign movies, basically, is something that we're nurtured. So I was really just trying to make the point that the television industry needs a similar sort of support, and therefore, fine, it's absolutely fine to have a debate about the BBC and what works, what doesn't work, and so on. But let's have that debate properly, and not make it just about the negatives, but also let's emphasize the positives. And then also let's talk not just about the possibility of cutting it back, but actually the other possibility of expanding it commercially. Because at the moment, I just felt, for the last 2 months, there's been this uncertainty. And if you have uncertainty over any other industry, jobs are on the line. We're waking up this morning to news about the Chinese economy, and that instantly whops knocks shares off companies here, these bad headlines do have consequences. So it's important, if you are going to create a rather frightened atmosphere, that you do something to address it sooner rather than later.
There was one report that picked up on the boss and this terrific phrase, "It's your show," because you did say within it, that's what the BBC used to be like, and that somehow they've lost that art of being an enabling, supporting network for.
I think it's gone through, and not just the BBC. I think this would be typical of Channel 4 and ITV. There was a period where, and I mentioned the separation of broadcast from production. There was a period when broadcast tried to run each show. So would speak to the producers about, would dictate who is in it, what the titles would be like, what the title of the show is, how it's going to end. Would have a real creative involvement in the show that actually led to the producers just becoming the dog's bodies who made the thing. And what I was pointing out last night is I think we're coming through that cycle, and we're coming out the other end where we think, actually, when you give the creatives ultimate responsibility to just get on with it, nurture them, obviously, and be there, support them, be attentive. If they're just starting out, they'll obviously need a helping hand, but be there as an enabler rather than this prescriptive overseer who dictates what's in the show. Once you start doing that, you do get these distinctive shows like The Fall, or like how the showrunners of Doctor Who have been allowed to just get on with it. And then you end up with distinctive things like Sherlock and Line of Duty and Peaky Blinders. And you get these much more confident shows that feel they have their own voice rather than a voice that's been imposed, a sort of corporate voice imposed on them.
And you say things are getting better. Is that because possibly this is a good time to be a creative because, apart from else, there's an open market because you have new companies like Netflix and so on wanting to take on the BBC, that they think, okay, so what works? Quality works. We've seen that was discussed the other day, that they're making this great documentary series about the Queen, fictional documentary about the Queen, but which was something the BBC would have done. So in a way, does that not show that the open market works and that the BBC doesn't need special protection? It's better for creators.
Well, what I'm saying is the BBC has contributed to that open market. I think it was Stuart Murphy was saying yesterday that at Sky, who've put a tremendous amount of money now into new production, they're not there to nurture new talent. Because they're a subscription service, they need to put a program out where people will instantly know what they're going to get. So they're there to just pull in stars. And he was saying those stars are grown on things like the BBC and Channel 4. It's actually the public service broadcasting sector that starts these careers off. You then hope that they can capitalise, the BBC can capitalise on it at a later date. So if you look at the big shows on Sky and Sky Atlantic, they've got big names in them. Those big names have had a career that's been partly nurtured through the BBC. So what I'm saying, that there is this balance that we have in our kind of broadcasting culture at the moment, where the BBC is sort of providing the quality standard that ITV and Channel 4 and Sky and whoever else wants to come into the market are aiming for as well.
So let's go on to the BBC. Your argument in the lecture was that it should remain in its comprehensive form, but cash in a bit on that imperialist ambition.
Yes, it's born out of my frustration that actually, if you actually work in the BBC, you are slightly hampered in being able to criticise the government because you are part of an organisation that's meant to be impartial. So I know there's a tremendous amount of frustration within people who work in the BBC or who work in indies who supply to the BBC. They just feel the counter-argument isn't being broadcast as vociferously as the anti-BBC argument is being discussed in the media. So there's that. But also, I really, and it's possibly an impact of my time working in America, where I have seen something like HBO, which has, you know, a quality about it and a brand recognition about it, how they're able to make tons of money by the fact that people can rely on that network with supplying them with quality. And it struck me that that is precisely what British television is. If you combine the BBC and Channel 4 and ITV with their best programmes, that is... Now, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we, as opposed to the whole debate about reining in and cutting budgets and drawing down and shrinking, why aren't we also talking about the possibility of expanding overseas, actually making ourselves a global industry based in the UK, where, for example, you suggest people pay whatever it is, $10 a month for a subscription channel that gets you the very best of British television.
So it's a bit like sort of museum charging, that here it should be free, but people
yeah,
use it abroad.
I don't think people want to see the license,
the
license fee going up.
No.
People are talking about how practical the license fee is over the next 10 or 15 years as a way of getting revenue. And therefore, if there is this pressure on the license fee, why don't we absolutely hell for leather look at other opportunities to make money out of what is this terrific... in preparation for doing the MacTaggart, I read previous MacTaggarts, which are interesting because you go back 20 years, 30 years, and it's discussing the same topics about hands off the BBC or the BBC now should take a back seat. It swings back and forth. The most interesting point I found was in Janet Street Porter's MacTaggart, where she said, look, we have a fantastic music industry, a film industry, a fashion industry, a design industry, and a television industry in the UK. But we don't have a global UK-based TV industry. We don't have something that's a global organization based in the UK, whereas we do with music and design and advertising. And why is that? And I have, you know, speaking to people who work in the BBC or who have worked there, I know there is a tremendous reluctance to explore or to talk about the making money aspect. I don't know whether it's part of the public service thing is it's slightly sordid to talk about money, or whether they're under pressure not to say that they make money abroad because it might lead to a headline in the Mail or the Telegraph saying, why is the license payer paying this amount of money when this money can be made abroad? So I think there's a reluctance to go all out to make money. And maybe we can use the opportunity of this review to change that and say, okay, have absolutely no qualms about how aggressive you are abroad in selling British television. If you have to hire some badass agents and managers and PR people and distributors, do that. Because we're sitting on something that's of so much value, it's hard to put a figure on it. You know, at the moment,
their big global money spinner was Jeremy Clarkson, I think, wasn't it? Who then had to go
that
for
and
was the problem.
that and Strictly Come Dancing, and it's interesting, you know, because you research these speeches as you prepare for them, and I did ask the powers that be at the BBC to supply me with information about how much money Strictly Come Dancing makes, you know, Dancing with the Stars and all the formats it makes. To which the reply was, oh yes, it makes money. But they're terribly reluctant to tell me the figure. And I think there's a sort of shyness about it because they just don't want to be, you know, they're in this damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they make money, they're criticised for making money. And if they don't, they're criticised for not making money. And I think we have to, let's use this opportunity for this review to just push that to one side. Push also to one side this whole other damned if you do, damned if you don't position about ratings. You know, if shows on the BBC get low ratings, they get bad headlines. If shows on the BBC get high ratings, they get bad headlines. So what are they meant to do? And what they do is do a sort of cyclical thing of for 3 years, they'll do, you know, The Voice and whatever to get big ratings. And then, having been criticised for it, they'll do 3 years of much more modest fare to show that they're really interested in doing alternatives to ratings. And then they'll get criticised for that, and then they'll buy the next voice.
So I'm just wondering about what reforms you would be prepared to see then. And one is if we did have then a separation of the BBC, a bit like the banks have invested the bad bit of the bank. And so you had the bad bit of the bank went out there and made the money.
Yeah.
That's a sort of investment bank bit of the BBC. And then you had, the good BBC that nurtured and made programmes. Could something like that work?
Yeah, I think what you wouldn't want to do, I think, is to create 2 tiers of the BBC, and if you can afford it, you'll get one, and if you can't afford it, you'll get a sort of BBC Lite. Because there was a suggestion during the rise of a sort of BBC Premium that if you paid a bit extra, you'd get slightly better programmes or a little bit sooner than if you were just paying the licence fee. I wouldn't want to see that. However, who's to say that you shouldn't pay a little bit more if you want to use the iPlayer, or if you want to access the entire BBC archive? Why shouldn't you pay a little bit more for that? Let's look at the websites. Maybe they should take some advertising. Or are there ways to, if the BBC is such a good programme maker, which I think it is, couldn't it, and I know they're looking at BBC Studios, couldn't they actually make programmes for other networks? If they're being criticised for putting shiny floor shows on a Saturday night on BBC One, couldn't they make shiny floor shows, which they're very good at, and sell them to Sky or to ITV, in the same way that ITV Studios makes programmes for the BBC?
So these are really very interesting new ways that the BBC could work. And why is it then that that you're not on the John Whittingdale review panel so that you can suggest?
Well, I'm not bidding for a post, but I just felt it was indicative of how the government is approaching this, that they only went to the managerial side of television when asking for advice on how the BBC should work, whereas the production side is what drives 95% of the BBC. If you ask someone in the street what they think of the BBC, they won't say, tremendously good cost-cutting exercises it went through over the last 3 years. My daughter and I are big fans of the reintegration of news with current affairs and their whole online rollout. They will say, Faulty Towers or Strictly Come Dancing, or I use my own personal viewing experience of Stargazing Live, which I think is something that only the BBC can do. So the programme, and going back to what we started saying, the content is, programme makers are in such a good position now, because actually, if we have an idea and the BBC don't like it, we can take it elsewhere. We can take it to Sky, we could go to Netflix, we could put it online ourselves. So actually, we're in the seller's market now, and hopefully. But the government doesn't seem to have taken that on board, that in fact it's the production side of the industry that will have suggestions on how to improve things. I mean, one thought I had from my experience of doing Veep, and something that we don't do in the UK so much, it's beginning to happen now, but it's taken a while, is that sense of regular commissions, that when you're doing season 1, you will hear pretty soon whether you're doing season 2. And it will be in a year's time. And when you're doing season 2, you will find out pretty soon whether you're doing season 3. And that allows you, that certainty allows you to be able to then, if you're doing a drama series or comedy series, plan ahead, plan a storyline that will take you through 2 or 3 seasons. It also means you can keep control of your cast. Because if you do one show, and it does very well, your cast instantly are famous. It's very difficult to get them back for season 2 because they're all now appearing in West End musicals based on the back catalogue of a rock star from the 80s who hasn't been arrested. So, you've got to try. And I'm not saying, the BBC should sit down and say, this is such a good show, we're going to give you 3 series. What I am saying is, if they talk more frequently to contributors and to producers, so that there is this relationship, you'll get a faster turnover of decisions. And we fell into the habit, I think, of making like a 7 or 8 part episode series of something, and then not finding out for another 6 or 7 months whether they want it back again. So that's one thing that I've taken from working in the American system that I think, and that's just a producer's experience. That's an on the studio floor experience that I felt. And I think, you know, if the government and the BBC were listening to ideas, you know, from that era, you would come up. I'm sure it also saves money as well.
Now, to put this to John Whittingdale about why there were not these creative people on the panel, and he said that he did have one, that he had tried to get one, and that they, in the end, had turned him down. And that's, and after that, we stopped there.
So did he not find another one?
No, we found the one.
He
said he'd had some private conversations.
There are several.
He did say that there was a problem with trying to get creatives to come onto his panel. And I don't know if that's because, you know, it's too boring or it's too distracting, but could that be that you need to start putting on a tie, you know, that there, as it were, that there are some people that because creatives, you know, tend to want to do creative things, they don't want to get involved in that, and that's why it's left
I'm happy to wear a tie for funerals and meetings with cabinet ministers. And it could well be that, you know, the message coming out of the culture department was, we're out for the BBC. Now, this was put to him yesterday, and he said, I've no idea where this has come from. And which made me think, yeah, but it has been hanging in the air for the last 2 months. So why haven't you said, I've no idea where this has come from? Why didn't you say that 2 months ago and put an end to all this uncertainty? It's been allowed to fester and to grow and therefore to encourage further speculation about Channel 4 and about foreign buy-ups of ITV, which haven't been denied. So we now have actually several more question marks hanging over the whole industry. And that is partly my point, which is, you know, as I said yesterday, media communications is 8% of our GDP. You know, it's more important than the car and oil and gas industry. So it needs to be taken pretty seriously. That's not to say you can't comment on it, or you can't say we need to have a discussion about it, but you do have to be very careful with your wording, and you have to be conscious of the fact that anything you, as a member of the government, say about something like the BBC or about British television, you know, carries weight and therefore carries impact, and that impact has consequences for the industry and the market.
I suppose he would say that you can't predetermine the outcome. So if you say from the start, actually, as he does seem to have said now, he doesn't want to dismantle the BBC. So I think you won your argument, actually. I think it's over.
Well, it's all over. It's all settled. We could all go home, finish the festival one day early, and get a good bank holiday weekend.
So if I can ask you sort of one last question, which is that you said, and it was an interesting thing, that the BBC had a sort of truer relationship with the country than the government. It was more representative. It was a sort of mirror. But if, which I think is true, that the British public rate the BBC highly and trust it and so on, why then are they not prepared voluntarily to pay? Why are we prepared to spend £1,000 a year on a Sky subscription, but not a voluntary subscription for the BBC?
Well, I know that they looked into that, and just technically it's such a kind of nightmare to try and impose something like that. I mean, I have spoken out in the past about how I don't think the license fee is going to last forever. It feels such an outmoded way of funding. But I think before you switch to something else over which there's uncertainty about how much funding you'll get, wouldn't it be better to have in place, first of all, more revenue coming into the BBC and public sector television generally by expanding your commercial activities abroad? So you've got a safety net before you start playing around with the domestic revenue collection. But I think it's an important point that, you know, people are prepared to pay money for Sky and Netflix and whatever, which is why I'm suggesting, you know, let's leave the BBC's free-to-air, apart from the license fee, obviously, services alone. But let's look at things like the iPlayer, let's look at the archive, let's look at co-productions they might do with HBO or Discovery and so on. Let's look at other ways that they can make money through apps and online. I just feel there is this culture within certain sections of the BBC that's slightly averse to making money. And I think we need to get over that. But to do that, we need to tell the media that it's not wrong for the BBC to try and make money outside the UK if it's trying to protect the licence and the viewer and the listener here.
Well, I think we've made great leaps forward today, have we not? I
There
think
we are.
Whittingdale may be grateful. And so if we could now take some questions from the floor. We've got, I think, about 20 minutes. So if you want to put your hand up, there's a lady there on the, if number 2 could go to the lady with the with the fabulous red hair. And if you could introduce yourself and say where you're from to them. Oh, sorry, I've got all that now. I've got a total.
That's number 3. There you are, number 3.
Can we have number 3 speaking first?
Let nation speak peace unto nation.
Thank you so much for such a wonderfully energising speech.
Thank you.
Is this too loud?
No, that's fine.
Because what you did last night was
Could
you
you just
asked...
say where you're from, if you're just so we
Sorry,
know
yes.
that? Yeah.
I'm Sophie Mason from BECTU, the union that represents the staff and freelancers at the BBC.
All right, yes.
So you asked the question last night about how do we address this debate, because Whittingdale was saying we have this debate every 5 years and, you know, nobody should be afraid. But the debate is framed, as you said, and almost castrated by the fact of the 650 million cost of the over 75s. And so when you ask the question, what are we going to, you know, how are we going to address this problem? This is effectively a 20% cut. And the staff have already gone through a freeze of the licence fee for 5 years. That has meant salami cutting their jobs, and now it's going to affect programmes themselves. So, you know, what we've done is run a campaign that we started called Love It or Lose It. And we've got online petitions, we've got big names like even Noam Chomsky, who signed it. We've got badges, and trying to galvanise the public and mobilise somehow that great love for the BBC, so that there is a pressure group that is so large that the government realises, as you were implying, that they would be massively unpopular. But what else can we do? Because you were the first one to really inspire everybody last night.
Well, I hope, I mean, all I can start is hopefully the conversation going, because I felt deeply frustrated that people either within the BBC or people like me who have just benefited immensely from working with the BBC, I haven't felt this groundswell of argument, the counter-argument. The thing with online petitions, so I think it's always easy to save one aspect of the BBC. So if the threat is to take Radio 6 music off, or to reduce Radio 1 or something, it's very easy to get a campaign about that because people know precisely what it is that you're trying to save. I think the problem is the BBC, everyone has an instinctive feel for the BBC, but because the BBC is ours, there'll be things about the BBC we like, and there'll be things about the BBC we don't like. And it's very difficult to say to people, yeah, I know there'll be aspects of the BBC that just drive you crazy, but fundamentally, if you really, really 99% love the BBC, you should support this. So I think it's down to us to be actually articulating, because I think we take the BBC for granted, actually articulating why it is we value the BBC so much. You know, it's down to us to help frame that argument and to provide people with points of discussion about the things that the BBC does. You know, just in preparing for the lecture, you know, I again was amazed by the amount that the BBC puts not just into programme making, but into investing in talent and finding new talent and nurturing, not just on screen, but behind the screens. You know, the fact that the rest of our channels, including ITV, are run by people who started at the BBC, the fact that it trains up the television industry in this country is something that the public don't hear very much about, and I think is
But
very
should they
important.
sort of step up to the plate a bit too? I mean, the over 75s that are going to benefit then for this their free TV. Why don't those that can afford it say, we don't want it, we're going to...
Well, I mean, at least the good thing is it's in the hands of the BBC, as John Wenty was suggesting, so they may want... I mean, the other issue about the cuts is, you know, the BBC is not a government department, and it was treated as such. And really big, major decisions about that with the BBC need to be debated in Parliament to start with, and then debated publicly.
But while
and the decision was made.
Yes, that's the trouble. Though. While there's that financial relationship, as soon as you have that, there is some kind
that
of...
is a problem. And while other government departments can be cut, you know, in good times, their budgets can be expanded. The trouble is, the cuts that are made at the BBC, they can't be restored. You're not going to get BBC Three back on television once it goes online. BBC News channels talking about going completely online, live streaming and off television. It's not going to go back on television after that decision is made. So these are decisions made in the heat of the moment that have permanent impact and can't be changed.
So
and therefore they merit further discussion.
Yeah, it's a 2 point. Okay, can we take another question?
It was number 2 was over there.
Number 2, yes.
Yes, so thank you and congratulations on such a powerful response last night to what has been a very one-sided debate. I'm Philippa Giles. My career has been shaped to the BBC as well, 25 years of making drama from producing Oranges Not the Only Fruit through, more recently, to Luther. I left the BBC at Christmas, and I think what we should do now that we've kind of established that the BBC, you know, is this bastion of huge artistic integrity, we must also look a bit more, in a more nuanced way, at some of the things which make it get atable, which is that middle management of the BBC has always been crap and continues to be crap, and we need to do something about that. So I don't think we should whitewash it totally.
No.
I'm sure you don't want to do that either. In, you know, what you've now established, hopefully Sarah's right, we've now, you know, changed the debate, BBC's sacrosanct, but there are bits about it that I think we could tease out more interestingly and discuss.
No, absolutely. I mean, I was calling, remember I meant there are 3 groups involved in this. There's production, broadcast, and politicians. Broadcast and politicians are talking to each other, and production is left out. And so actually what we have to do is get a culture where government talks to both broadcast and production, but also production and broadcast are talking to each other.
But don't you think, Armando, actually that's the BBC culture? It doesn't talk to
its
creatives.
Absolutely.
So,
and, you know, I could do an alternative MacTaggart where I outline all my processes of frustration over the years.
We can have that, that's fine.
You know, internally at the BBC. I just felt last night was not the time for that. At the moment, this isn't the time, because there is a bigger question about what do we value about the BBC, which if it is switched off, we will not be able to switch back on again. And I really want to get that absolutely firmly out there and everyone joining that discussion. Once that's done, I'm more than happy and already have had conversations internally with the BBC about how, as I mentioned earlier, the thing about commissioning a lot quicker and backing off from doing too many notes from on high and letting, you know, there's all that to be examined as well. But I feel that is an important discussion, but it's one that we might have to just put slightly to one side at the moment while we address this much, much bigger question.
Isn't it relevant, though, within the... If you are going to reform the BBC, this is a good time, is it not, to talk about it? And if the middle management is crap, as you allege, I mean, what would you suggest? Do we need a culling, or do we just need a change of culture? Or how did it get to be crap when you know what makes
well, I
work
think,
very
you know,
well?
if you want to trace it back historically, it's when broadcasters hived off from production. Broadcast, therefore, needs a sort of purpose. It needs a building, it needs offices, and, you know, these things grow if they're given space. I think, as I said about HBO, it's a very tight, small, it's almost like a family business. You know, I was amazed because you expect, you know, the makers of The Sopranos and The Wire and all these big shows, you expect it to be this amazing, huge edifice. And it's not. It's this small building that it shares office space with out in Santa Monica, where I literally had one executive that I spoke to about Veep, Casey Boyce, who was the head of comedy there. Occasionally Mike Lombardo, the head of programs, would chip in, possibly at the start of each season, at the end of each season, but fundamentally one person. I think that's an amazing lesson to be learned, and you know, if the review throws that up, fine. I certainly don't want to be saying, you know, the BBC is absolutely perfect, and you know that not the 9 o'clock news sketch where they were doing points of view and it said, "Dear BBC, I would happily pay twice my license fee for everything that you do." I'm not saying that. Of course I'm not saying that. But I think we would all suffer and all feel the loss if we allowed the pressure on the BBC to shut down content, basically. It makes, some of the best content in the world. And it seems a rather kind of clod-hopping economic approach to actually be suggesting it makes less of it, or not so popular, not so well.
So was it really that John Whittingdale's just been like one of your sort of bad executives of blundering into something that he has no business talking about? But he could say, as he has done actually, could there be efficiencies? Could you, if it's become a bit bloated, could you deal with that?
But actually, the statistics show that it's one of the most efficient companies in the UK, and in terms of broadcasters, it's the broadcaster that ploughs a higher proportion of its revenue back into programmes than, say, Sky or ITV or Channel 4. So, in terms of efficiency, I'm sure there's always more. It's not really going to make such a difference that it will bring the licence fee down by 50 quid. And that's fine. It's a valid argument. I'm not deriding it, but I'm just saying there are far bigger, more pressing issues that could be looked at.
Number 4. The back.
Yeah. I'm Peter York, and I'm a writer. In your wonderful speech last night, you talked about the dark forces ranged against the BBC, and you very funnily called them M. Could you identify them a bit more closely? What are the main elements, what are the motivations, what are the strategies, and what are the mythologies they want to propagate about the BBC?
Well, there's all your M's. Mythologies, methodologies, main elements.
We missed one.
I called it M because, to be honest, I'm not so sure. That's the thing. We all feel so puzzled as to where this is coming from. And you hear all sorts of rumours. You hear, is it the Murdochs putting pressure on, or is it the Daily Mail, or is it a cabal within the Department of Culture? Is it backbench MPs? Is it other newspaper editors? I honestly don't know, which is why I left it rather like a thriller-like writer, leaving the M is the MacGuffin that you'll have to work out for yourself.
But I think we should be told, don't you, as part of the full... you were talking about full disclosure to follow.
Yeah. Yes, I would like them to come forward and announce themselves. That's why I was saying, politicians actually say what they believe. And I just find this deep frustration whenever I investigate, the government's argument for and against the BBC, that it seems very much tilted against. I talked about their green paper, that they laid out the case for the BBC, and on surface level it appears very reasonable, because they'll say on the one hand the BBC does this, but on the other hand there's an argument for saying it does that, and all the other hand is in very bold print, whereas the nice stuff about how well the BBC. And I was talking about the charts at the BBC, the charts they put up about the BBC. In fact, we didn't have time to show it yesterday, but I think we've got the chart I was referring to yesterday, where this was a whole page of their document, which was to show how the BBC has expanded between 1994 to 2014, and how massive it's. Look at it, it's on 2 to 9 and all that and so on. But what I was saying is, yeah, that's all very well, that's all accurate, but what you're not putting it against is the context of how every other network has expanded in that time, and about how all television has expanded in that time. And we found this next chart, which shows the same thing, but in a different context, which is how the BBC has grown as opposed to the number of UK channels. And you see, actually, by 2014, the BBC is actually a smaller proportion of UK television than it was in 1994. Now, I'm having a bit of fun here by playing around with the figures. My point is, why is the green paper presented in that one-sided way? Why is it all about the costs of the BBC but very little about the benefits, or very little of its efficiency compared with other networks. That's really my point. So I would genuinely want to know what is driving them in this direction to take this slightly one-sided interpretation of the BBC.
Could it be that there might be a little bit of in all of us, that when you, even people who love the BBC, and you hear within the discussion within the BBC themselves, things irritate listeners about
that's
the BBC.
The thing. The
so
BBC,
there's a cultural thing that sometimes is just annoying.
Yeah, the BBC is owned by us.
Yes,
and
exactly.
therefore, we are entitled to talk about the BBC.
Yeah.
It also means that every aspect of it is slightly exposed to, public inspection. And therefore, we know an awful lot about the management and the expenses.
And we all have a view because we're all,
exactly.
as it were,
in a way that we don't
shareholders
know about what goes on inside the management of Coca-Cola.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd love to know what their expenses are like and how they, how efficient they are. All they have to do is decide what flavoured drink to put out that day. I think it'll be Coca-Cola today. It worked yesterday. Whereas they've got all this space to fill.
So if you're under scrutiny all the time, obviously that puts you into a frame.
And
the other thing is to do with competition, isn't it? And I think, on the websites you made a clever, funny point that what's the BBC to do be less good. But I suppose the argument against that was it could be less well funded because other people trying to compete where they are having to fund it privately. Don't have those advantages. If the BBC didn't have the same money, it couldn't send people all over the world.
But the
so
BBC, as part of its previous charter granting, and I think the one prior to that, were told specifically by the government to lead the way in developing online services. Mm-hmm. So they were authorised and instructed to do it. And they did it really well. And they did it before other newspapers did. They did it before local newspapers got their act together and did it. They did it really well.
It's terrific.
And they've led the way. The iPlayer, Netflix talk about how much they've learned from the iPlayer. So why are they being penalised now?
But if you said...
For doing it too well.
No, if we said we love it that you're so good, so could people now pay a subscription for it or take advertising or something that put you onto a slightly more level competitive?
Or as I read as one suggestion, forming partnerships with local papers and, of course.
Yeah.
My frustration is born about the fact that I don't feel every avenue has been explored in this. There's just been a set approach to it, which is, competitors don't like this, so let's ask whether it's causing problems for competitors. Rather than saying, let's look at ways in which it can help competitors. Let's look at ways in which this service that we have and that is sort of publicly owned can enable competitors to come up with a better service.
Good. Another question. Should we have 3?
Hello there, Martin Stanford from Sky News. Thanks for the lecture last night. I wonder your comment on the tendency of some people really senior in the BBC to rather have a simplistic or a bit childlike discussion when anything about their funding or their scope is challenged. I think you alluded to this, in the sense that they then come out, as I say, rather childlike with, we're going to have to shut BBC 2, we're going to have to put David out of the box for 10 years, and we'll kill all local radio. I mean, that's not very... I got cut off.
You did.
It's not a very sophisticated way of debating it, is it?
So, childish debating?
I wouldn't say it's childish, but, that's one of my frustrations as well, is that... and it's a difficult position they're in, because if they just came out and told everyone to fuck off and leave us alone, obviously that will create the wrong sort of headline. So they feel slightly hampered. But I do wish, and maybe that's why it falls to people in, the production, people who have worked, who aren't employees of the BBC, but have benefited from the BBC, to come forward and say, no, look, Mr. and Mrs. Government, there is another side to this. This is how I've benefited from it. These are the programs that we've been able to make that I wouldn't have been able to make the thick of it on another network. This is what we would lose if you go on trying to shut or restrict the BBC in the way you're talking about. But I'm with you. I said I did a BAFTA lecture about 3 or 4 years ago, and I said, I'm frustrated by this tendency of the BBC when they're accused of a crime, even one which they haven't committed. They have this tendency to go and hand themselves in at the first police station. You know, and I really wish they wouldn't. They should go on the run. That's what they should. Or hire better lawyers. I don't know, but
Why are they so weak at advocacy, though? If not
but it
defending
is
themselves?
that fear, I think. It is that, and it's been battered into them over the last 10 or 15 years of attracting the wrong publicity, the wrong headlines. You know, it's easier in the way to concede because it just gets it out of the way, you know. Except it doesn't. It just creates another problem, which is why are you shutting down BBC Three off television when it nurtures so much comedy and drama talent, when we don't really know yet whether people are going to find it on the iPlayer.
Number 2.
Hi, Tom Latcham, freelance journalist. You talked about the public and how this is going to cause huge outrage and it's going to come back against the government. You're preaching to the converted here, and by the way, it was a fantastic speech, and I loved it, and I think we all did. And I think it struck with all of us what you were saying, and we all value the BBC. But do you genuinely believe that the public feel the same as us? I mean, this is, of course, the public that knew that they were going to cut billions from the welfare state and voted them in.
Except 36% of them voted them in.
But you know, do you actually think that the public care in the way that we all do here?
I think they do. My fear is that they will only notice when it's gone.
And so what can we do what can we do to
our job is to try and make them much more aware of what they would lose if it went. Of course they're not going to shut the BBC down, but I think it's this limiting of BBC services. Well, you could point out that how much you would have missed if Six Music had shut down, or how much you're going to miss when BBC Three shifts to online. And then, as I say, you have to then very patiently and methodically go through what you think are the pluses for the BBC and bang on about it, annoyingly, I think. And so my hope is that this has at least galvanised some more people to come out and say, well, I feel there are an awful lot of people within the BBC who would love to speak out and say something. And I hope they do. And already online you're getting, say, BBC campaigns and petitions and all of that helps. You need to build it up further so it gains a kind of momentum. So if you're a freelance journalist and you felt that way about the speech last night, then write something about it.
I'll try.
Okay.
Though we do return to the sort of nature of the BBC, that if you said to people, you will lose it, then people think it's what they'll lose. So obviously they think Radio 4, but if you said to someone, oh, you'll lose The Voice, then you start to divide people, because some people will say, well, that's fine. So it's tricky, isn't it? And The Voice is, we always come back to The Voice, but the Whittingdale argument is that it's fine when you've bought something on that's original, you've nurtured it, it turns out to be a great success, they'll go out and sell it. When you've just bought in something, when the BBC becomes obsessed with ratings, not in that they want to make unpopular shows, but they're starting from the wrong place, not is it good, is it, what will it, but is it...
Yeah, I mean, tiny point, first of all, the figure used by the government about how much the BBC paid for The Voice, the original owners of The Voice said that wasn't the figure. That figure appeared in the Daily Mail, but it wasn't actually
We need
the
more or less, that wonderful Radio 4 program.
So there's that. But look, if the BBC... I talked about there is a global market now. BBC is going to have to go into co-production with other networks to make things. It's got to sell its programs overseas. If you want to participate in that global market, you can't have free trade and protectionism at the same time. You can't say to the BBC, go out there and sell everything, but certain things you can't buy. Already you're hampering your sales pitch, really, because you're not playing a full part in that open market. Also, if you're saying you can't buy in foreign formats or programs, then very different from The Voice. Borgen, The Killing, The Bridge, the whole Scandinavian noir. So how do you decide? Well, in the end, you have to leave it to the judgment of the team running the BBC, and you will disagree with some of those decisions and the others you agree with. Of course, I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect, but I just think picking up on one programme And it very much sounds to me like this whole inquiry has been into The Voice, really. At which point you say, well, how much is the government paying for this inquiry into The Voice? And is it more than the BBC paid for The Voice? You know, there's a lot more at stake than The Voice. You know, I wouldn't be heartbroken if The Voice never came back. I wouldn't be devastated, but I would be devastated if BBC's quality and range of programming was curtailed.
You've put up with this terrific defence of the creative television, and as I say, really sort of raised everyone's spirits. You're now going to work in film, aren't you?
Oh well, the next project is film. But I'm talking to the BBC, and I hopefully something for the BBC, and also I have an open relationship with HBO, and but I've said whatever I do, I want to do it here. I don't want to do it in the US. You know, my base is here, my home's here, so it will be UK based.
Well, thank you so much, Armando Iannucci. I think we've got to stick to the time because there's another event coming on. But I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think, as I say, that the lot for that Whittingdale panel, I think, now to consider. And I think if only we could have voices as strong and clear and eloquent and witty as yours. But I think that's the message, that if you love the BBC, you have to speak up for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Armando.